Whose maid is this? Someone get her out of my dining room before the photographer arrives. Beatrice Achebe's voice cut across the marble hall, and every head at that engagement dinner turned toward the small woman standing near the entrance in a faded green wrapper, holding a woven basket of plantain like an offering nobody wanted. She had traveled 6 hours by bus to be there. Within 4 minutes, she would learn that the man everyone in that room called Chief Daniel Okonkwo, the billionaire whose company built half the bridges in the southeast, was about to stop the entire evening cold with 5 words that would humble a family who had spent their whole lives believing money was the only thing that made a person matter. Stay to the end, because what Daniel Okonkwo said next didn't just silence a room. It rewrote everything his fiancée's family thought they understood about who deserved a seat at their table. Comment your city below, hit subscribe, and let's go back to where this really started. Comfort Adaeze Nwosu had taught primary school in the village of Umuahia for 31 years, in a single-room schoolhouse with a tin roof that turned every rainstorm into a drum solo the children learned to shout their lessons over. She never married. She never had children of her own body. What she had instead was a chalkboard worn thin at the center, a small government salary that arrived late more often than it arrived on time, and an open-door policy for any child in that village whose own house had gone quiet with hunger or grief. Daniel came to her in 1994, 6 years old, carried into her classroom by a neighbor 2 days after his parents died within a week of each other, his father from a fever nobody could afford to treat properly, his mother from a grief that simply stopped her heart. The neighbor set the boy down on the wooden bench at the back of the room and said, plainly, that nobody in the extended family had room or money to take him, and that someone needed to decide what happened to him before the Harmattan season made an orphan child situation considerably worse. Comfort looked at that boy, small and silent and refusing to cry in front of strangers, and made a decision in less time than it takes to grade a single test paper. She took him home that evening to the 2-room house behind the schoolyard where she lived alone, and she never once treated the decision as temporary, not to him, not to herself, not to the village that watched and waited to see how long her generosity would last before reality wore it down. Reality tried. Her teacher's salary had never been designed to feed 2 mouths. She took in extra sewing work after school hours, mended school uniforms for other families at prices low enough that pride never stopped anyone from asking, and grew what vegetables she could behind the house because the market prices climbed faster than her salary ever did. Daniel remembered, even decades later, the specific sound of her sewing machine running past midnight while he pretended to be asleep on the mat beside her bed, the rhythm of it becoming, for him, the actual sound of safety. She never once let him feel like a burden she was carrying. That was the part that mattered most, the part he would spend the rest of his life trying to properly repay. When other children teased him about having no real mother, calling him the schoolteacher's charity case, Comfort sat him down that same evening and told him something he never forgot. Blood makes you related to somebody, she said. Choosing makes you family. I choose you every single morning I wake up, Daniel. That is a stronger bond than any accident of birth could ever build. He was 7 years old when she said that. He carried the sentence with him into every boardroom he would eventually sit inside. She pushed him harder than she pushed any other student in that schoolhouse, not because she loved him less gently than her own affection suggested, but because she understood, better than most people in that village, exactly how thin the margin was between a poor, orphan boy who made it out and one who didn't. She made him recite his multiplication tables while helping her fetch water. She traded sewing work for second-hand textbooks whenever a family in the next village upgraded their children's school books. When he won a partial scholarship to a federal secondary school 2 towns over at age 11, she sold the one piece of jewelry she owned, a thin gold chain that had belonged to her own late mother, to cover what the scholarship didn't. He tried to refuse the sacrifice. She wouldn't hear it. Gold sits in a drawer and does nothing, she told him. An education walks around inside you for the rest of your life and does everything. He wore that sentence like armor through every difficult year that followed, through the crowded boarding house dormitories, through the years he worked as a laborer on construction sites during university holidays to help cover his own remaining fees, through the small engineering firm he built from almost nothing in his late 20s that eventually grew. over the following decade into Okonkwo Infrastructure Group, one of the largest privately held construction conglomerates in the country. Every single year of that rise, Comfort remained exactly where he had found her, teaching the same single classroom in Umwahioribiku, refusing every offer he made to move her somewhere grander. He built her a proper house with real plumbing and a roof that didn't drum in the rain. She accepted that gratefully because she understood the difference between refusing help and refusing to let money change who she fundamentally was. But she wouldn't take his money to stop teaching, and she wouldn't move to Lagos to live inside the mansion he eventually built there, no matter how many times he asked. "My work is here," she told him simply, each time he raised it. "There are children in that classroom right now who need exactly what I once gave you. Who is going to give it to them if I leave?" He stopped asking eventually, though he never stopped sending a car for her whenever he traveled home, never stopped calling every single Sunday evening no matter which country he was closing a deal in, never stopped introducing her to anyone who would listen, as the reason any of his success existed at all, which made what happened at that dinner considerably harder to understand and considerably easier to predict. Once you understood exactly who Beatrice Achebe was and exactly what she'd spent her entire life protecting. Daniel had met Ivy Achebe 2 years earlier at an infrastructure conference in Abuja, where she worked as a junior policy analyst for a government ministry her father had considerable influence over. She was sharp, genuinely intelligent, and refreshingly uninterested, at least at first, in his company's balance sheet. He fell for her slowly and carefully, the way a man falls for someone after having spent years too busy building an empire to notice he was lonely inside it. He proposed 8 months into their relationship, and Ivy said yes with what appeared, at the time, to be genuine joy. Her parents were a different matter entirely. Chief Obiora Achebe had built his own considerable fortune in oil servicing contracts 3 decades earlier, and his wife Beatrice had spent every year since constructing an increasingly elaborate performance of old money refinement around a family that was, in truth, only 2 generations removed from circumstances not so different from the ones Comfort Nosu had spent her entire career trying to lift children out of. Beatrice had simply chosen to forget that history as thoroughly and as permanently as possible, and she policed the memory of it in everyone around her with the vigilance of someone terrified the truth might resurface at exactly the wrong dinner party. She had heard, in the vaguest possible terms, that her future son-in-law had been raised by a relative after losing his parents young. She had not asked for specifics, because specifics in Beatrice's carefully curated understanding of the world were rarely flattering, and she preferred her narratives clean. When Daniel mentioned, in an early conversation meant to be warm and informative, that the woman who'd raised him was a village schoolteacher who still taught in the same one-room schoolhouse she'd worked in for over 3 decades, Beatrice had smiled the particular thin smile she reserved for information she intended to quietly file away and never mention again. The formal engagement dinner was scheduled for a Saturday evening at the Achebe family's Victoria Island residence, an event meticulously planned to introduce Daniel's side of the family to Lagos society. 300 carefully selected guests, a photographer from a national lifestyle magazine, a menu curated by a chef flown in from Paris for the occasion. Daniel had specifically requested that Comfort be included on the formal invitation list, had specifically told his assistant to arrange proper transportation and accommodation for her, had specifically mentioned to Ivy, more than once, how important it was to him that his mother, as he always called her, be treated with the honor she'd earned. What Daniel didn't know, because he was traveling back from a site inspection in Port Harcourt that same afternoon, and had entrusted the final logistics to his assistant working alongside the Achebe family's own event coordinator, was that Beatrice had quietly intervened 3 days before the dinner. She'd instructed the coordinator, in a tone that brooked no discussion, that the elderly relative from the village should be seated at a smaller side table near the kitchen entrance rather than at the family's head table, and that the car arranged to collect her should be, in Beatrice's exact words, something modest, "We don't need to make a spectacle of picking her up." The coordinator, eager to keep her contract with a family as socially prominent as the Achebes, complied without asking too many questions. Comfort arrived by bus instead, because the modest car Beatrice had authorized never actually showed up at the small transit station where it was supposed to meet her, and after 90 minutes of waiting with her small overnight bag and the basket of ripe plantain she'd brought as a gift, The same instinct that had carried her through 3 decades of village hardship simply took over. She found her way to Victoria Island by public transport, asked 3 separate strangers for directions once she arrived in the unfamiliar part of the city, and walked the final distance to the Achebe residence in slippers that had carried her through countless muddy village paths but had clearly never been designed for a marble-floored Lagos mansion. She reached the gate an hour and 20 minutes late, flustered, dusty from the journey, still holding the basket she'd carried the entire way because setting it down anywhere along the route had felt, to her, like abandoning a piece of home she'd meant to bring with her. The gate security, following instructions to admit only confirmed guests and having received no clear briefing about an elderly village relative arriving separately from the family's arranged transport, initially refused her entry entirely, assuming, reasonably enough given her appearance and the chaos of her arrival, that she'd wandered in from the street. It took considerable insistence, and eventually a phone call the guard placed to the event coordinator, before Comfort was reluctantly allowed through the gate and directed, not toward the grand entrance where guests in evening were still arriving beneath a canopy of white orchids, but toward a side service entrance near the kitchen, because by that point the coordinator had simply assumed, given how she'd arrived, that this was where she was meant to go. Inside, the dinner was already well underway. 300 guests moved through the Achebe family's cavernous dining hall beneath crystal chandeliers, waitstaff circulating with champagne, a string quartet playing softly near the garden doors. Comfort stood at the edge of the kitchen entrance for a moment, uncertain, scanning the enormous room for any face she recognized, holding her basket of plantain like the only solid thing left in an evening that had already gone sideways in ways she couldn't quite articulate yet. That was when Beatrice Achebe noticed her. Beatrice crossed the dining hall in a shimmering gold gown, her expression shifting from polished hostess warmth to something considerably colder the moment her eyes landed on the small woman in the faded green wrapper standing uncertainly near her kitchen staff. "Excuse me," Beatrice said, loud enough that heads at the nearest tables turned. "Whose maid is this? I don't recall approving extra kitchen staff for this evening." A ripple of quiet laughter moved through the guests closest to them, the particular laughter of people who've learned that cruelty delivered with enough elegant confidence can pass. "In certain rooms, for wit." "I'm not staff, Ma," Comfort said quietly, her voice carrying the careful, measured cadence of someone who had spent decades commanding a classroom full of children but had never once needed to raise her voice to do it. "I'm here for the engagement dinner. I'm Daniels." "Daniels what?" Beatrice cut in, her tone somewhere between amused and genuinely offended, as though the mere suggestion required correction before it could spread any further. "Look at this. Someone please find out how a village woman wandered into my dining room, carrying farm produce." She gestured, with visible distaste, at the basket of plantain still cradled in Comfort's arms. "Get her out before the photographer arrives. This is exactly the kind of image that ends up in the wrong newspaper column." 2 of the event staff moved toward Comfort, not roughly, but with the brisk, apologetic efficiency of people following an order they didn't particularly want to enforce, but felt they had no standing to question. Comfort didn't fight them. She had spent 31 years teaching children that dignity wasn't something you defended with your fists, and she wasn't about to abandon that lesson in a stranger's marble dining hall. She simply straightened her shoulders, held her basket a little closer to her chest, and allowed herself to be guided toward the door, her eyes scanning the crowded room one last time for any face that might recognize her. She never found one, because at that exact moment, the main entrance doors swung open, and Daniel Okonkwo walked in still wearing his travel clothes, having come straight from the airport without stopping to change, precisely because he'd wanted to be there in time to personally walk Comfort into the room himself. He took in the scene in less than 2 seconds, the staff guiding a small, dusty, obviously exhausted woman toward the door. The basket of plantain clutched to her chest like something precious she refused to let go of. The particular set of his adoptive mother's shoulders, the posture she'd carried since he was 6 years old, the posture of someone absorbing an indignity quietly rather than making a scene about it, exactly the way she'd always taught him not to make scenes about the unfairness the world occasionally handed you. "Stop," Daniel said. He didn't shout it. He didn't need to. Something in his voice carried across that entire crowded dining hall with a force that silenced the string quartet mid-phrase and turned every single head in the room toward the entrance. The event staff froze instantly, hands still hovering near Comfort's elbow. Beatrice turned, already composing an explanation, the gracious smile of a hostess catching her fiancé-to-be's future son-in-law's attention at exactly the right social moment. "Daniel, darling," she began smoothly, "there's been a small misunderstanding with a village woman who wandered in from—" Daniel crossed the room without waiting for her to finish the sentence, and every guest in that hall watched a man worth more money than most of them would see in 3 lifetimes drop to one knee in front of a small woman in a faded green wrapper and dusty slippers, gathering both her hands into his own with a tenderness that had nothing rehearsed about it at all. "Mama," he said, loud enough now that his voice reached every corner of that stunned dining hall, "I'm so sorry I wasn't here in time." Then he stood, still holding one of her hands, and turned to face the entire room. To face Beatrice specifically, his expression carrying none of the polished diplomatic warmth he'd worn through 2 years of these kinds of gatherings. "This is my mother," he said. "Not by blood. By everything that actually matters. She raised me from 6 years old after I lost both my parents, in a house with no running water, on a teacher's salary that barely covered our food most months. Everything I've built, this house you're standing in, belongs to a family whose fortune came from the same country she taught in for 31 years, exists because of the sacrifices this woman made for a boy nobody else wanted." The silence that followed had a texture to it, thick and uncomfortable. 300 pairs of eyes moving between Daniel's furious composure and Beatrice's rapidly draining color. Somewhere near the back, a champagne glass clinked softly against a table as someone set it down too quickly. "Daniel," Beatrice said, her voice considerably smaller now than it had been minutes earlier. "I had no idea. If someone had simply informed me." "She was on the guest list," Daniel said, cutting through the excuse with a calm that felt considerably more dangerous than shouting would have. "I personally requested her seat at the head table. I arranged transportation for her myself, through your event coordinator, 3 weeks ago." He turned to the coordinator, who had gone pale near the kitchen doorway. "What happened to that arrangement?" The coordinator's eyes darted, involuntarily, toward Beatrice, and that single flicker of a glance told the entire room everything it needed to know before another word was spoken. Ivy, who had been standing near the garden doors through the entire confrontation, face flushed with a horror that seemed, at least in that moment, entirely genuine, stepped forward. "Mummy," she said, her voice tight, "did you change the arrangements for Daniel's mother?" Beatrice's mouth opened and closed once before she found words. "I simply thought, given the nature of the evening, given our guests, that perhaps a smaller, more intimate seating for an elderly relative from the village might be more comfortable for her. I was thinking of her comfort." "You put her at a side table near the kitchen," Daniel said flatly. "You sent a car that never arrived. She traveled here alone, on public transport in her 70s, because your staff left her waiting at a bus station for over an hour with no explanation." He looked around the room slowly, at the guest who had laughed moments earlier, at the photographer who had lowered his camera entirely, sensing, correctly, that whatever image would define this evening had already been decided, and it wasn't going to be a flattering one for the hosts. "Everyone in this room just watched my mother get thrown out of a dinner in her honor because she arrived tired and dusty instead of polished, because a basket of plantain looked wrong beside your imported flowers, because none of you bothered to ask who she was before you decided she didn't belong here." Beatrice's composure, the same carefully maintained performance she'd spent 3 decades perfecting, cracked visibly for the first time in front of an audience she'd spent her entire adult life trying to impress. "Daniel, please, we can discuss this privately. There's no need to." "There's every need," Comfort said quietly, and the room's attention shifted entirely to her for the first time. The small woman still holding her basket of plantain, her voice carrying none of the trembling humiliation the earlier scene might have suggested, only a calm, steady clarity that silenced the room more completely than Daniel's fury had managed. "I've spent 31 years teaching children in a classroom with a roof that leaks when it rains. I've taught the sons and daughters of farmers, of market traders, of people who counted their naira twice before spending it, because every single one of those children deserved to be treated as though they mattered." She looked directly at Beatrice. "You looked at me tonight and decided, before I said a single word, that I was beneath the room I was standing in. You didn't know my name. You didn't know I raised the man your daughter intends to marry. You only knew that my wrapper was faded and my slippers were dusty, and that was enough for you to have me removed like something spilled on your marble floor. She set the basket of plantain down gently on the nearest empty table, the gesture somehow more devastating than any accusation could have been. I brought this because in my village, you don't arrive at someone's celebration with empty hands, no matter how humble what you're carrying might be. I didn't come here expecting a head table or a photograph in a magazine. I came because Daniel asked me to, and because I have never once in 31 years missed being present for something that mattered to a child I raised. She paused, and her eyes moved slowly across the assembled guests, many of whom now found reasons to study their own place settings rather than meet her gaze. I only wonder how many of you laughed a few minutes ago at a woman you assumed was simply lost kitchen staff, and how differently every single one of you is looking at me now that you know whose mother I actually am. That difference, that exact difference, is the whole problem with this room. Nobody applauded. Nobody laughed. The string quartet, uncertain whether to resume playing, simply remained silent, their instruments lowered. Ivy crossed the room and took Comfort's hand, her own eyes wet, and said, quietly enough that only those nearest could hear, I am so deeply sorry. This isn't who I want my family to be, and it isn't who I want to become married into. Chief Obiora Achebe, who had watched the entire confrontation unfold from near the head table with the particular stillness of a man calculating exactly how much damage had just been done to his family's carefully constructed reputation, finally spoke. Beatrice, he said, his voice low but carrying an authority that made his wife's shoulders tense visibly. You will apologize to this woman properly, and you will do it now, in front of everyone who watched you humiliate her. Beatrice stood frozen for a long moment, the calculation visible on her face, the recognition that refusing would cost her something considerably larger than her pride in front of 300 witnesses and a magazine photographer who had already, discreetly, begun taking pictures again, this time of an entirely different story than the one the evening had been planned to produce. Finally, stiffly, she crossed the room and stood in front of Comfort. I am sorry, Beatrice said, and the words came out with none of the warmth she'd shown any guest that evening. But they came out clearly enough that everyone present heard them. I judged you by your appearance before I knew anything about who you were, and that was wrong of me, regardless of who you turned out to be. Comfort studied her for a long moment. Regardless of who I turned out to be, she repeated quietly. That is the part you should think about tonight, madam. Not that you were wrong about me specifically, but that you were prepared to treat any woman who looked like me exactly the same way, and you only regret it now because it happened to be the wrong woman to treat that way. She let the word settle, then added, more gently, I don't need your apology for my own sake. I've survived worse than one evening's unkindness. But somewhere in this city tonight, there's another woman just like me, dusty from a long journey, carrying something humble because it was all she had to bring, and she deserves better than what I received here, whether or not anyone important is waiting to defend her. Daniel, who had remained close beside Comfort through the entire exchange, finally spoke again, his voice calmer now but no less resolute. I love your daughter, he said, looking at Chief Obiora and then at Beatrice. That hasn't changed tonight. But I need everyone in this family to understand something clearly before this engagement moves forward. My mother is not a footnote in my story that gets mentioned once and then quietly filed away at family gatherings. She is not going to be seated near the kitchen at my wedding, or spoken of as a relative from the village in polite company, or treated as anything less than exactly what she is, which is the single most important person in the life I've built. If that's a problem for anyone in this family, I need to know it tonight, rather than discover it slowly across the next 50 years. The dinner, needless to say, did not continue as planned. Guests departed earlier than scheduled, murmuring among themselves in the particular hushed tones reserved for having witnessed something they would be discussing for weeks. The magazine ran a considerably different story than the one Beatrice had envisioned, a story about class, humility, and the quiet dignity of a village teacher, accompanied by a photograph of Daniel kneeling in front of Comfort that would go on to be shared and reshared across social media for months, generating a wave of public admiration for Comfort that no engagement dinner photograph of the Achebe family's curated elegance ever could have matched. In the weeks that followed, Beatrice's carefully maintained social standing took a hit considerably more lasting than a single uncomfortable evening. The story spread quickly through Lego society circles, embellished in some retellings, understated in others, but always carrying the same essential shape. A wealthy woman had humiliated a humble teacher without bothering to learn who she was, and had been publicly corrected by the one person whose opinion of her actually mattered to her social ambitions. Several of Beatrice's own social committees quietly stopped extending invitations to events she'd once been central to organizing, a consequence considerably more painful to her than any direct confrontation could have been. Daniel didn't call off the engagement, largely because Ivy's own reaction that evening and in the weeks that followed convinced him she genuinely didn't share her mother's values, however deeply Beatrice had tried to instill them. Ivy insisted, over her mother's continued discomfort, that comfort be given a place of genuine honor at the wedding itself. Not a symbolic gesture for photographs, but real involvement in the planning, a seat of actual prominence, an invitation extended and honored properly this time. With a car that arrived when it was supposed to and a welcome that matched the respect she'd earned rather than the appearance she happened to arrive wearing. Comfort attended that wedding months later in a beautifully embroidered blue gelly and wrapper that Ivy had personally commissioned for her from a tailor in Umwahia, insisting the fabric come from Comfort's own village rather than any Lagos boutique. She sat at the head table, exactly where she'd been meant to sit the first time, and when the toast began, Daniel stood and told the entire wedding party the same story he told at the engagement dinner, this time without any anger in it at all, only gratitude. A boy who lost everything at 6 years old and found, in a single-room schoolhouse with a leaking tin roof. A woman who decided he was worth every sacrifice she had to make. Beatrice, to her credit, had used the intervening months to do something Comfort hadn't expected, but quietly appreciated. She had visited Umwahia Biku twice, unannounced both times, sitting quietly at the back of Comfort's classroom and watching her teach, watching the patience she extended to children whose families could offer nothing beyond gratitude in return. She never fully articulated what those visits changed in her, but her behavior at the wedding was noticeably different, warmer, considerably less performed, and when she approached Comfort during the reception, her apology this time carried none of the stiffness of the first one. I've been thinking about what you said, Beatrice told her, about the woman I was prepared to treat that way regardless of who she turned out to be. I don't think I've fully become a different person, but I understand now exactly what I was, and I'm trying to make sure my granddaughter, whenever she comes, doesn't inherit that same instinct from me. Comfort accepted the sentiment for exactly what it was, an honest, incomplete beginning rather than a finished transformation, and told her, gently, that beginnings were usually the only honest place any real change ever actually started from. Daniel eventually used a portion of his company's community investment fund to fully renovate Comfort's schoolhouse in Umwahia Biku, replacing the leaking tin roof with proper construction, adding a second classroom, and establishing a modest scholarship fund specifically for orphan children in the surrounding villages, administered not by his own corporate foundation, but by Comfort herself, alongside 2 other retired teachers she trusted, because she insisted the decisions about which children needed help most urgently should be made by people who actually understood village life, rather than executives reviewing spreadsheets in a Lagos boardroom. She still teaches there today, 3 decades and counting, in a classroom that no longer drums under the rain, still walking the same paths she walked as a young woman who decided, in less time than it takes to grade a test paper, that a frightened 6-year-old boy deserved a mother even though nothing in the world had legally obligated her to become one. If there's a single thing worth carrying away from what happened at that dinner, it's this. Respect that only appears once someone's importance is revealed was never respect at all. It was calculation dressed up as manners. The measure of who we really are isn't how we treat the people who can advance our position in the world. It's how we treat the woman in the faded wrapper standing quietly near the door, before we have any idea whose mother she might turn out to be. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs reminding that dignity was never meant to be reserved only for the people wealthy enough to demand it. And remember that the smallest, most humble person in any room might be carrying, in a worn basket held close to their chest, more grace than the entire gathering combined.